I like these chairs because the creaky makes it seem like you're in an inn. Another pint, barkeep.
Chris, anything?
Chris?
Nay.
Welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair, a global Witcher podcast. My name is Alyssa from GoodMorhen, and I'll be your host as you, I, and our international hanza accompany Geralt of Rivia and his destiny, Cirilla of Cintra, across the continent. We have new friends in the company to introduce in this episode. I'm excited to introduce Duncan D. McNuggets and appropriately Sebastian von Novigrad, who've become our newest patrons of the show. They join producer-level patrons Louise of Covier, the owner of the Churlish Porpoise, Cool Guy Henry, Eric's the Godling, Katie the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob, Mahakam Elder Joe, Julie, Sylvia Skelga, Will P., Brandon, Jameson, Ava of Gullet, and Eric the Bear of Beauclair. As producer-level patrons, they receive an introduction shout-out, a spot on the website, monthly bonus content, stickers, a t-shirt, an exclusive producer gift, and producer credits in each and every episode. If you'd like to explore becoming a patron of the show, head over to patreon.com/breakfastinbeauclair. As for this episode, Chris returns with his friend Adi to discuss The Eternal Flame from Andrzej Sapkowski's Sword of Destiny. We recorded this episode a month before the Netflix premiere, so you'll hear some of our Thanksgiving time speculation about the adaptation while we host Continent Theology School and discuss themes such as historical economics, the history of pigments, Sapkowski's use of Chekhov's gun, and Chris and Adi's upcoming fanfiction about the notorious Roacho. Larson Wisherflix is on a much-deserved holiday this week, so during the mid-episode break, I'll host a special little edition of Tidings from Toussaint with celebratory news for members of our international hanza. After the episode, head over to Are the Hanza and jump into our community discussion with your thoughts, reactions to the episode, or bring up new themes and ideas that we didn't cover. Without further ado, let's get to this episode's short story, The Eternal Flame. Welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair. My name is Alyssa, and joining me today are our friends Chris and Adi from Atlanta. Hey guys!
Hey Alyssa.
Some of you guys might recognize Chris from episode 1, and Adi, who's his friend who tried to convince you to get into the Witcher saga. So that friend's Adi.
Yep, that was me.
And you failed miserably, right?
I pride myself as being a missionary for The Witcher, and Chris is one of my toughest converts.
So you started the job and I finished it?
Yeah, we work as a good team.
I'm into it. Chris, how are you?
I'm good. Glad to be back.
It's actually Thanksgiving at the time of recording. So I'm back in New Jersey and Chris and Adi are home in Atlanta.
Yeah, we grew up here. Both our families are here. That's pretty much how we know each other.
So I think as we spoke about in episode 1, Chris, this is your first time reading The Witcher's saga, and you've currently read The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny compilations, correct?
Correct.
And Adi, you are very familiar with the Witcher saga, right? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
That's right. So I started playing Witcher 3 when it first came out, and after that I was immediately hooked, and then I read all the books in order, then I played Witcher 3 again. I watched the 90s Polish TV show, like a couple of episodes here and there. I played Witcher 3 again, and I read the story again.
So what was it about the Witcher series that really got you hooked? Is there anything that stood out from any other franchises or titles?
Yeah, I'm a huge fantasy nerd, so I love, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, everything. And so I got into the series after playing the game. It was just like a match made in heaven. It was a perfect match for me.
Yeah, then I got to spend several months with him badgering me and several other people to buy the game.
I told my coworkers and everything. Like, I told everyone to spread the word about The Witcher.
Every time it went on sale, he would be the first one to text me to be like, it's on sale, just get it, you have nothing to lose, you'll love it.
Well, we love a profit. Today, Chris, Adi, and I will be discussing The Eternal Flame, the third short story in Andrzej Sapkowski's Sword of Destiny. In part 1, Geralt enters the city of Novigrad and runs into his friend Dandelion, unsurprised to find him in trouble with a local woman, Vespula. After escaping the lovers' quarrel, the pair head to the Spearblade, a tavern, and meet an acquaintance of Dandelion's Dainty Beavervelt, a halfling from a large merchant family. Suddenly, the door to the tavern bursts, revealing Dainty Beavervelt. Chaos ensues, and the first Dainty Beavervelt, revealed to be a Doppler, is captured and questioned, then escapes. When the chapter first opens, Geralt has wandered into the city of Novigrad. The first thing that he hears or notes is the sound of something very heavy hitting the ground, and he notes that it's a jar of cherry preserve. And he comes across Dandelion, who, unsurprisingly, is having a quarrel with a local woman named Vespula, who's chucking things out of her home, and he's just kind of dodging them in the street. And that's, of course, the scene that opens the chapter.
My favorite part about that whole thing is just like this whole scene is unfolding. There's like the fight, and then Geralt comes up, he's like, oh, hey, Dandelion. It's like, oh, hey, Geralt.
I like how she also chucks another dude's pants down.
Yeah. So Vespula is just so angry with Dandelion because supposedly he cheated, which is probably true. He doesn't necessarily believe in monogamy, as we know about his character. So she's kind of throwing all these things at the house, and she's like, take your belongings. She throws him down a pair of pants, which he picks up, and he's like, these aren't mine. They're too ugly to be mine. How can you get mad at me for being unfaithful and then throw another man's trousers at me?
I mean, he has a point.
So the whole thing is very absurd. I think every time we see Dandelion, we always know we're in for a good time, especially in these short stories. He really reminds me of the comedian Gabriel Iglesias. He has a friend named Martine, and anytime he has a bit with Martine, you know it's going to be a good time. And yeah, just reminds me of this.
In many ways, Chris is my Dandelion, and I am Geralt.
Wait, what?
I just need a roach.
I don't remember having this discussion about me being Dandelion.
Okay, fine. Chris is my roach. And I'm Geralt.
All right, that's better. Where were we?
We were talking about how, Chris, you're the ultimate sidekick.
Oh, yeah. No, so I am a loyal steed. Adi, say something.
Yeah, he's a great steed. He's fast. He's strong. He's horse-like. Everyone gets a kick out of his equine wiles. He smells good. Not that he smells good, but he has powerful olfactory sensory mechanisms.
What did I just listen to?
You always forget that Roach is also completely dispensable, I guess. Geralt just calls every single one of his horses Roach.
Yep.
So what are you saying about me?
I name every one of my friends Chris.
Anyways, back to Dandelion.
Back to Dandelion and the story. Geralt enters Novigrad, runs into Dandelion, they're talking to Vespula, and eventually she throws his loot. Dandelion catches it, and then now that he's got his loot, he and Geralt decide to head off to the Spearblade Inn. We learn a lot more about Novigrad, which is really exciting, and it is a destination that gamers can see in The Witcher 3. It's a really blown-out, beautiful city in the game, and as I said, we learn a lot more about it here as Geralt talks to Dandelion. Dandelion calls it the capital of the world, and he calls it the center and the cradle of culture. We hear that Novigrad has a population of about 30,000 plus travelers, and it has all sorts of facets of industry. Things like brick houses, cobbled main streets, a seaport, all sorts of businesses, a mint, 8 banks, 19 pawnbrokers, manufactories, a castle, a guardhouse, yada, yada, yada. And then what Dandelion calls diversions. So a scaffold, a gallows, 35 taverns, a theater, a menagerie, a market, and a dozen whorehouses. Can't remember how many temples, but plenty. So we do hear that it's much more established than a lot of the other locations that we've seen throughout The Witcher.
I honestly have not got to that point in the game just yet, but Adi, you've played.
Yeah, it's great. It's crazy how much, like, if you actually look at Novigrad's square footage, quote unquote, it's not like super big necessarily, but it is super dense.
Yeah.
CD Projekt Red did a great job in having like depth to the city, so to speak. So it really feels like it's really, really big.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of places to explore, which is really nice. I always really liked the opportunity to just go looting everywhere in Novigrad.
Nice. They should really have a Cops. You know that TV show Cops? They should really have one, but it was just you, Alyssa.
You want police to be chasing like Geralt down an alleyway?
I mean, they do that if you start taking out your sword and bashing things. Everyone's on alert. But if you go in and you just pickpocket a bunch of people...
Larceny's fine. Just don't hurt anyone.
You can get away with thievery, and it's okay.
I like the idea of Geralt like being chased down an alleyway on like, a 90s camcorder if it's cops and they like have him against like the wall. They're like searching him. They pull out a bag of weed. They're like, "Is this yours?" And Geralt's like, "No, it's definitely not mine."
I'm just holding it for a friend.
We do know that Fistek,
Yes,
is the drug of choice.
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
Yeah. They do have something that seems like it's like a cocaine equivalent in the Witcher world called Fistek. But I also don't know anything about drugs, so it could be a different kind of drug. But the drug of choice in the Witcher world is called Fistek.
But what was this origin? Like, who creates it?
I have no idea, but it's referred to a couple times throughout the saga.
Who is the El Chapo equivalent in the Witcher universe?
I have no idea. Maybe you should just write a fan fiction about it.
You should write a erotic fan fiction about
What?
the
Why
El Chapo.
Why is it erotic?
Because it sells, people. It can't be non-erotic fan fiction. It has to sell.
Okay, that's true.
So, erotic fan fiction about drug use and some version of El Chapo named, I guess, El Roacho, because you find out Roach is actually the drug lord.
And Roach is right under the nose of Geralt.
So Geralt is the detective, and he's so inept at his job that the person he's been searching for is the horse that he rides on daily.
Exactly. Now get to writing. I want it on my desk by 3 p.m. today.
It's a Saturday.
It's 1:30. You better get to it, Chris. So we go with Geralt and Dandelion into the Spearblade, which is really exciting. While they're there, Dandelion was meant to stop by in order to pay for going to the Spearblade the day before. And there's a cute little exchange between Dandelion and the innkeeper, in which the innkeeper is just like, "I'm content to see you, minstrel sir. I see that your word is indeed your bond. After all, you promised to stop by first thing to pay for yesterday's exploits. And I, just imagine, presumed you were lying as usual. I swear I am ashamed." And Dandelion says back, "There's no need to feel shame, my good man, for I have no money." So it's just something that, I think is really wonderful about his character in this sort of unapologetic demeanor that he has. I find it really funny. While they're back there, Dandelion is kind of seeking a benefactor for his exploits. He first asks Geralt. Geralt, as they're walking to the inn in the first place, says he doesn't really have any money because he spent it on new goods as well as a new leather jacket. And then when they get to the inn, Dandelion hears that Dainty Beavervelt, who's an acquaintance of his, is also there. Naturally, Dandelion goes to try to talk Dainty into being their benefactor and to paying for food and a trip to a whorehouse.
No, we don't believe in whorehouses. This is a good Christian household. Actually, what denomination Christianity are we?
I'm Eternal Flame.
When we first get to the Spearblade, we meet Dainty Beavervelt, who is a halfling. And halflings are a very specific class within the Witcher universe. So we meet a few different kinds of non-humans here for the first time. So we get halflings, dwarves, and gnomes. Halflings, I would say, are most similar to, let's say, hobbits. Dwarves, we already know. We've met in the Bounds of Reason before. And gnomes are also new to the Witcher universe for us, reading through the series for the first time.
Yeah. Halflings. They're not fullings. They're not quarterlings. But half.
The Bard and Witcher start talking to this halfling, Dainty Beavervelt, who is part of a large merchant family. So Dainty is just kind of sitting, trying to eat, and then Dandelion strolls over and starts a conversation with him and introduces Geralt, the Witcher. Dainty seems rather hesitant, and he asks why Geralt is here. Is he here on a contract? And Geralt just says, "No, I'm just here for pleasure." And as they're talking, the door to the Spearblade slams open, and then in walks Dainty Beavervelt. The only difference is that the Dainty at the table is clean and the Dainty in the doorway is very, very dirty. All of a sudden there's two of them, and I think Geralt reacts the fastest. There's a small brawl that breaks out. It turns out that the Dainty Beavervelt that was in the Spearblade already, the clean one that was eating, is something called a Doppler. It's also referred to as a changeling, a vexling, or a mimic, and it's ultimately a shapeshifter that has taken the form of Dainty Beavervelt.
So the thing that's interesting is the question that Dainty asks. He gets a little nervous about the Witcher being there. So it's kind of the first sign that there's something wrong, kind of a foreshadowing that there's something going on here, because why else would he be nervous about Geralt being there? Is he onto him? Does he know that he's a Doppler?
After the brawl breaks out, the Witcher is able to capture this Doppler, and he wraps it up in a silver chain, which prevents it from transforming. So it turns into something, Geralt notes, that looks like a mix of mud and flour, and it's just kind of droopy and lumpy, and it just can't really hold shape. It's now in its natural form. The real Dainty Beavervelt starts threatening it, trying to kill it, and it turns out this Doppler had attacked the real Dainty Beavervelt in the woods on his way to Novigrad, knocked him out, left him presumably for dead, and then took command of his company and his horses. When he got to Novigrad, the Doppler sold the horses and is now at the Spearblade. Throughout the chapter, there's a lot of talk of trade and business that happens. That's really important to follow along as you read. We learn a lot about Dopplers here, and this is a new class of monster which we haven't encountered yet before. It's interesting here to really see, again, as we see repeatedly throughout chapters like The Edge of the Worlds in episode 5 from The Last Wish, as well as a number of others, where you see the dynamic between humans and non-humans, humans and monsters. The Doppler asks, have mercy, don't hand me over to humans. Do you know what they do to the likes of me? And the innkeeper, who was kind of wandered in at this point, says, naturally we do. The priests perform exorcisms on any vexling they catch. Then they tie it up with a thick stick between its knees and cover it thickly with clay mixed with iron fillings, roll it into a ball, and bake it in a fire until the clay hardens into brick. At least that's what used to be done years ago, when these monsters occurred more often. The real Dainty Beavervelt says, a barbaric custom, human indeed.
Yeah, it reminds me of my favorite line for The Witcher ever, which is where somebody's like, oh, you're a Witcher, you have 2 swords, one for humans, one for monsters. And Geralt says, no, they're both for monsters. And I was like, whoa. Also, what the fuck does this guy look like? this Doppler? It's like he's made out of clay or mud? Yeesh.
Yeah, he apparently looks like mud mixed with flour. But for whatever reason, when I imagine it in my head, he's always kind of blue. Not for any good reason, and it's not supported by the text at all. But in my own head, he's just this translucent blue.
Yeah, I side with the innkeeper. If I saw that, I would have been like, yeah, this has got to go.
I could add in a little more about Dopplers from Geralt. Geralt, as a Witcher, he's obviously able to talk about the bestiary that exists on the continent. So he tells the group that all a Doppler has to do is observe its victim closely in order to quickly and unerringly adapt to the necessary material structure. I would point out that it's not an illusion, but a complete, precise transformation, to the minutest detail. How a mimic does it, no one knows. Sorcerers suspect the same component with lycanthropy, but I think it's either something totally different or 1,000-fold more powerful. After all, a werewolf has only 2, at most 3 different forms, while a Doppler can transform to anything it wants to as long as the body mass more or less tallies. He won't turn into a mastodon or a mouse. It's not an exaggeration, believe it or not, but at this moment it is you, Dainty. In some unknown way, the Doppler also precisely copies its victim's mentality.
I like how Dainty was confused by the word mentality. He's mental what? So the one thing about this to me is Dopplers are, to me, one of the most powerful creatures, simply because they can disguise themselves in all shapes and forms. There's no real way to know that it is a Doppler unless you have the original. Mm-hmm. So you would think that the entire realm would just be occupied by Dopplers, because there's really nothing stopping them.
And it could be, for all we know.
This is true. Does no one else think of Ditto from Pokemon?
Oh, of course.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Maybe that's why I think of it as translucent and amorphous.
Even Ditto. These creatures, it's very interesting to see what their base form is. I still can't visualize. I imagine it looks like when you try to make a chocolate cake and you didn't shift the flour, so there's just clumps of flour in your chocolate cake batter, and you pour that on the floor and then tie a silver chain around it, and you're like, this is a Doppler.
Maybe you should cosplay as that. Just cover yourself in cake batter, yeah.
With the silver chain chained up.
Just sit on the floor and be like, please, you don't know what humans will do to me.
Dope. The group start questioning the Doppler, which we learn his name is Tellico Lungrevic Litorte, or Penstock, or Dudu. So the group continually throughout the chapter refer to him as Dudu. We learn that Dainty had journeyed to Novigrad to sell horses, and a day's ride from the city, his group camped, and while alone, he was knocked out by an apparition of himself. So he wakes up by himself with no sign of his companions, and then walked the last 2 to 3 days to the city alone. In that time, Dudu is able to get up to a bunch of things while posing as Dainty. They try to figure out what's going on. It turns out that Dudu sold Dainty's horses, but he has no money on him. So now they're trying to figure out, well, if you sold all these horses, where'd the money go? Dudu says that he sank it back into goods. When they ask him what the goods were, they're incredibly, incredibly nonsensical junk. Dudu tells them he bought 1,000 bushels of cochineal, 6,200 weight of mimosa bark, 55 gallons of rose oil, 23 barrels of cod liver oil, 600 earthenware bowls, and 80 pounds of beeswax. And then he mentions that he bought the cod liver oil very cheaply because it was a little rancid, and he also bought 100 cubits of cotton string. And there's just this silence that falls over the group because it sounds like junk. Dainty is just like, oh my god, this is the end of me. My reputation as a merchant is ruined. All my money is gone. How can I go home? Yada, yada, yada. The entire thing takes a turn when this man arrives in a purple toga and a hat that's noted as looking like an upside down chamber pot. Schwan comes in looking for Dainty and says that Dainty needs to pay taxes on the profit that he got. And Dainty's like, what fucking profit? And the Witcher and Dandelion have to silence him because they can't let it out about the Doppler. The Doppler in Schwan's arrival was able to escape. So now the real Dainty, Dandelion, and Geralt are dealing with Schwan on their own. Schwan tells Dainty that he owes Novigrad 1,553 crowns and 20 pennies, and he needs to pay it by tomorrow.
So I know that they said that the Doppler has to take the shape of something that it has the ability to closely analyze. It seems like it's just perfectly set up for them to be like, okay, yeah, you take the shape of Dainty, everything will be fine. But that obviously is not the situation that unfolds. And I'm a little bit confused as to why they were like, yeah, we can have two Dainties in the room. The one that's not a Dainty, leave him unchained and free and do whatever he wants. The whole scene seems like it's just poorly thought out.
Well, there's a sense of urgency to the scene, I think. They're not expecting Schwan, for one. You have the innkeeper who keeps wanting to shout for the guards, but Dandelion, Geralt, and Dainty won't let him. So when they suddenly have to deal with something and there's nowhere for the Doppler to go, presumably, yeah, that's when they ask him to then turn into Dainty because he was just Dainty. I think you're right, though. Like, why didn't they tell it to turn into, like, a dog or something, like, nondescript? But it's one of those things that, the plot.
I think the Doppler outsmarted them because, well, not to give it away, but it is part of the story, but we do see, like, later on that he has the ability from memory to, you know, turn into whatever he wants. So he undoubtedly has come across other characters that he's turned into. So he kind of tells them, like, oh, it needs to be someone in this room. So he's already thought ahead to be like, I just need to turn into one of you. It'll help with my escape.
I mean, ultimately, you're right. It does help him escape. We do know that halflings are very agile, and we see this a little later in the chapter, but we also note it for the first time here. In his escape, Dudu, as Dainty the halfling, throws the contents of a jug at Geralt, kicks the stool out from under Dandelion, and then just sprints out past Schwan and starts screaming bloody murder, saying that there's like murder, a fire, da-da-da-da-da, and then just runs out and is gone.
And there is a second point to that, because before all this happens, I forget who said it to Geralt. I think it was Dainty or the innkeeper, where it's like, you're a witcher, why don't you just kill him? And the witcher's like, I kill monsters, I don't kill anything with intelligence. They look at the Doppler, and they're like, yeah, the Doppler, like, based on his appearance, barely looks like he qualifies as an intelligent creature. He, like, looks like these big eyes. He's, like, really sad looking. He's, like, you know, blubbering, being like, please don't give me up, whatever, whatever. And in this moment, we see that, oh, he's actually pretty conniving and pretty cunning because he fooled, like, all of them.
No, I think it's really cool that we see like these new type of monsters that are not necessarily scary per se. Because like if you're looking at it from the conventional Western fantasy Tolkien-esque world, so this is a fresh new way to look at them.
Because like dwarves and elves have humanistic characteristics.
That's right.
I mean, they're still considered a class of non-humans, but they definitely are more humanoid.
I think it is interesting how it could sort of like copy someone's mentality, but also, like, I don't want to jump the gun too much, but somehow can't copy their soul, so to speak. Like, they still have their own personality in there, and the question is, like, that doesn't get erased.
Because that's the whole thing about clones, is clones don't have, like, the memories.
Oh, I don't know. Do they have memories? Does the Doppler have memories of Bieberveld, the real Bieberveld?
I'm not sure, actually. I would say they don't have the memories of them, but I think they do take on the personality, the mannerisms, the habits.
They wouldn't have the memory. Because I think Dudu was very confused when Dandelion came in and like screamed his name.
Although he did know where to go. Dudu did know where to go. Like, he knew which banker Dainty used. He knew where the Spearblade was and, like, that it was probably Dainty's tavern of choice. So there are, like, little things here and there, but I don't know how much of that is ingrained or not.
I'm wondering if you could call that memory or if you call that, like, some form of intuition.
Yeah, I wonder if it's intuition or impulse.
Impulse, yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, if anyone out in the universe has like any thoughts on it, write to us, let us know. But I think for the purposes of this story, I don't think we could answer that question for certain. In part 2, the Witcher, Bard, and Halfling are confronted in an alleyway by Chappelle, the Minister for Security Affairs for the Novigrad Secret Service, about the Doppler. Dainty is suddenly found by a merchant acquaintance and the guild's treasurer, Muskrat, angry that Dainty has made an enormous profit on Cochineal due to a coup in Povis. In light of this news, Dainty takes Geralt and Dandelion to visit the banker, Vimy Vivaldi, who may have some information for them.
Has Netflix announced who the actor for Chappelle is going to be? Because if it is not Dave Chappelle, I'm going to be very upset.
I don't think that they're adapting this story directly. We do know that they have cast Dopplers for a couple of actors that aren't part of this story. So I have a feeling we're going to learn about Dopplers in the Netflix show, but they're not going to be part of the Eternal Flame.
Are any of them going to be Dave Chappelle?
No.
I hope in Lars's next segment, he's like, great news, exciting news. Dave Chappelle has joined the Netflix series.
You've had your ear to the ground better than I have about the show. So they're not like direct adaptations like, okay, this is the Eternal Flame, this is a Shard of Ice, exact replication of the story, right?
It's a mix. It's a mix of things. So we do know that certain characters have been cast, and we do know that certain adaptations are being done, as well as the fact that the order of them might be a little bit surprising, how they're told and the way that the stories weave themselves in order to create a narrative that's not just about Geralt, but also about Yennefer and Ciri in a way that isn't done in the Last Wish and Sword of Destiny books. We do know that they're adapting stories like The Witcher, The Lesser Evil, A Question of Price, The Edge of the World, I think they're adapting as well. A Shard of Ice, I think to some extent may be adapted because we do know that Istrid is cast. The actual adaptation of them might be surprising, and I think they've broken apart some stories, pieced them together, taken monsters and characters here and there, and then also made new monsters, which is something that I think Lauren Hissrich talked about in an interview. She mentioned that her and Thomas Baginski, who's one of the producers, went through Polish fantasy and Polish folklore and created new monsters for the series that have, some sort of fantastical precedence. So we are meant to see Dopplers in some capacity in the Netflix series, but I have a feeling that it's not going to be a direct adaptation of The Eternal Flame.
Okay, back to part 2.
Part 2, we are dropped outside with Dandelion, Geralt, and Dainty. They're trying to decide what to do. Dainty is obviously very upset that he has to pay this tax tomorrow and he doesn't know what to do. It's 1,500 crowns, which is, a lot. They're soon surrounded by 2 groups of men and this man, Chappelle. Geralt is getting very antsy because he's being put in a situation that he doesn't like. He's getting this kind of fight feeling. And Dainty and Dandelion try to tell him to stop because this is someone who's incredibly powerful and this is someone who's incredibly dangerous. Chappelle comes over to them and he lets the group know the innkeeper at the Spearblade accused them of collusion with the changeling of Vexling. As they're getting into it, they start talking, and Chappelle is this very righteous person. He's part of the Secret Service in Novigrad, which is subservient to the Temple of the Eternal Flame. He brings up a few points. First of all, Vexlings, Dopplers, changelings are not real. Secondly, why would a Vexling come up to a Witcher and not be killed immediately? He says that the most vital detail is that even if there were such things as Vexlings, there can be none because the eternal fire burns throughout the city, and anyone who says that a monster can step into Novigrad close to the eternal fire, close to where this religion, these temples are, is a heretic.
Well, I'm really enjoying all these people who come up to Geralt and they're like, this couldn't have happened because otherwise it means you're bad at your job.
Yeah, that happens a lot, doesn't it?
Geralt's profession is also one where it's like, like an exterminator technically works to make his job obsolete.
Yes.
What a contradiction his business is. The better he is at it, the worse the business is.
Yeah. after Chappelle has laid out all that information that 1, Vexlings aren't real, 2, they shouldn't be in Novigrad, and 3, how could a Vexling approach a Witcher? After Chappelle has laid out all this information for Geralt, Dandelion, and Dainty, he takes Geralt's away for a private word. And Geralt is very, very angry at this point. You hear some of his inner monologue, and he's like, if he touches me, I'm going to kill him. Like, stuff like that.
I know that feeling.
He sounds like an angsty, like, middle schooler. He's like, oh, man, if Mr. Richards touches me again, man, I'm going to just fucking go. I don't respect authority, man. I just want to get out of this dump. All right, go on.
That's kind of like what he's doing here. He's very, very upset. And ultimately, there is a line that says, like, Chappelle didn't touch him. But Chappelle asks, what would be the price for you to get rid of a Doppler? Geralt tells him, I don't hire myself out to hunt monsters in crowded cities. An innocent bystander might suffer harm. Chappelle responds, are you so concerned about the fate of innocent bystanders? And Geralt says, yes, I am, because I'm usually held responsible for their fate and have to cope with the consequences. This is something that I would assume has developed after stories like The Lesser Evil, where, he ended up in a crowded town at a market of all places to fight Renfri. No one had any idea what was going on. There was no context for why he was there fighting her and her gang. He slaughtered them all and was ultimately named to the Butcher of Blaviken, which we know. This is an event that continually follows him and also informs a lot of his future decisions. This is something that we see here in his short interaction with Chappelle, and that we're also going to get to see in the show with Henry Cavill's Geralt.
That's actually an amazing point. I didn't think about the character development just exhibited. Also, I miss Renfri. She was a good character.
The cool thing that we know is in the Netflix series, Renfri wears a brooch in the trailer, and that's the brooch that ultimately ends up on Geralt's sword. So we do know that he takes it along with him after that point, and it's always with him and always informs his decisions. At the end of this section, Chappelle gets a little preachy on Geralt and on the readers, but we do learn a little bit about the eternal fire and what it means. The sentiment behind it is actually really interesting and very beautiful, as culty, I think, as it is. Chappelle says, do you know what the eternal fire is? A flame that never goes out, a symbol of permanence, a way leading through the gloom, a harbinger of progress, of a better tomorrow. The eternal fire, Geralt, is hope for everybody without exception. For if something exists that embraces us all, you, me, others, then that something is precisely hope. Yay, religion. I'm not a huge fan of organized religion, but I can appreciate a sentiment like this one.
What about disorganized?
Yeah, what about disorganized religion?
I'm super into disorganized cults.
I am curious about the this universe's religion. So there's like the Prophet Lebioda, there's like Meledali, and then there's the Skellige, Freya, whatever. And then there's Eternal Fire, and then there's like the Great Sun.
It's a very rich world when it comes to religion, especially. And I think we might have talked about that in some other episodes. But there are local religions, there are broad ones, there are ones that have similar deities under different names. So it's as rich, I think, as you'd find in like our world.
Yeah, but here's the thing that I also notice about like Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, like all the big fantasies, including The Witcher, is that in the actual medieval world, everyone is talking about God like nonstop. Everyone's talking about religion, spiritualism, whatever, nonstop. It's interesting that it's not as pronounced in a lot of these fantasy books. Like it's there, as you said, like it's rich, it's really detailed. But the characters themselves are not walking around constantly talking about hell, heaven, whatever, God.
Yeah. Well, one, I think that different religions have different values when it comes down to it. For example, all the way in episode 2, like the Church of Coram Agtera, the lion-headed spider, has just like skulls and bones and green flames everywhere. And they probably value something much different than the Temple of Meledali, which is focused on womanhood and harvest. But in terms of things like the Christian concept of heaven and hell, you're right, we don't see that in any of these religions. And I wonder if that's dictated by the religion or by the fact that all of our main characters aren't religious. So we just don't learn about it because they don't care.
Well, do we know if they're actually religious or not?
As far as I know, and Adi, you can jump in too, it doesn't seem like Geralt's particularly religious at all. He has like his own moral code. That code seems to be agnostic or atheistic.
I feel like he just isn't a fan of organized religion.
Yeah. But I mean, he has his own values. Like religion and personal values, societal values aren't necessarily, mutually inclusive or exclusive.
And his views are constantly evolving.
Yeah, exactly. It could be a matter of their profession that they choose, especially sorceresses. Maybe they choose like science and magic over organized religion. We're not really sure.
This was our Witcher theological class.
I'm into it. The very last bit that we get in part 2, we learn a little bit about what Dudu has been up to. After Chappelle leaves, Geralt, Dainty, and Dandelion are approached by this man, Muskrat. Muskrat runs over looking for Dainty. It turns out that Muskrat is very upset because Dainty got a huge profit on the cochineal that he bought. Dudu, rather, had seemed to have bought all this junk. One of these things had been a ton of cochineal for seemingly no reason, and it turns out that there was a coup in Povis. So it turns out that the old clan in Povis previously wore blue, and the weaving mills there only bought indigo. But the color of the new ruling family is scarlet, so the price of cochineal has gone up. And it turns out that Biebervelt had the only available cargo and was able to set the price. Presumably this is like insane, like insider trading of some sort.
Yeah. How would he possibly know? How would anyone possibly know that?
We have no idea.
No,
what is cochineal?
Oh, yeah.
I think it's just a pigment. I think it's a red pigment.
Let's Google that real quickly.
We're looking it up.
Ew.
What the hell is this? It's like a bug. It's a scale insect in the suborder Sternocorinthia.
Oh, it's like the bug that they made like red pig. You know how like the like red dye that they use in like Skittles and stuff is made from ground beetles?
Jesus, I did not know that. I wish I did not know that. Well, Skittles got a skit.
I was actually watching something not too long ago on how they create pigments. In historical oil paint, they were saying that, like in some of the best oil paints, up to 75% of the paint itself is pigment. Historically, they used to derive it from all sorts of places.
It's a very Sart thing to do, but just to think about like how many bugs we crush to get color out of them. And also like things like people, hunting muskrats for their glands to make perfume.
It must have been the video that I saw. I think it was a snail. And you needed like thousands of these snails to make like 2 grams.
Yeah, to make purple dye, yeah.
Yeah, it was purple, I think. Thousands of them for like 2 grams. It was insane.
They're a snail type of like shell creature, and on the banks of like what we call the Levant, they would like harvest them and they would crush them and then turn them into purple dye, and they would sell that to Rome, or they would make like, put that into togas or whatever.
Well, speaking of, Schwan is wearing a purple toga.
He is! I was about to say that.
So apparently it's called Tyrian Purple. 1 gram of this dye is made from the secretion of 10,000 large sea snails, which is crazy.
That's a lot of crushing of like...
snails.
Yeah.
That's a lot of snail crushing.
How sad.
It is really sad. Well, anyway, so now that we know what cochineal is...
All right, part 3 is actually the one that I'm excited about, because then we engage in commodity trading.
With all this new information about what Dudu has been up to while he's been posing as Dainty, Dainty makes the decision to go to a bank close by, which is run by his dwarven friend, Vimy Vivaldi. And that takes us to the end of part 2. So before we visit Vimy Vivaldi with the Witcher, Halfling, and Bard, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, Chris, Audie, and I will continue with the Eternal Flame. Hey, it's Alyssa with a special edition of Tidings from Toussaint. A week ago, I asked members of our International Hanza what amazing things they achieved in 2019. And for this week's news segment, I wanted to celebrate their achievements with you. Our friend Christian launched his coffee company this year, Mojo.coffee. Mojo was the very first sponsor of the podcast back in episode 4, and I'm really excited to see where his business takes off to in 2020. Jameson welcomed his 5th child into the world, Tommy and his wife had their first, Aurora passed her driving test, Gary made it to his last semester of college, Heather got into grad school, Rob landed a full-time job, Dalton got engaged, Leia married her best friend, Francie did a lot of traveling this year, Maddie moved across the US, bought a house, and started writing again, John wrote, directed, and staged his own sketch comedy shows in Texas, Abby created his own musical score, Sean, along with 11 other members of our community, took part in a cover of Toss a Coin to Your Witcher, which has racked up nearly 10,000 views in the last 2 weeks and caught the attention of composer Sonia Belusova, writer Jenny Klein, and the bard himself, Joey Beatty. many members of our community also wrote about making strides in other areas, such as overcoming anxiety, leaving toxic relationships with friends and family, changing their relationships with mental health, and coming into their own identity, accomplishments that might be outwardly invisible but should also be celebrated. Those are some of the toughest battles, and myself and the hanza are here for you. Lastly, thank you so much for helping me build this community. Launching the show has been one of my greatest accomplishments of the year, and I can't wait to see how our community grows in the next. Well guys, that is it for me today. Lars will be back in the next episode of Breakfast in Beauclair. Until then, thanks again for listening, and good luck on the path. Thanks for the update, Lars. Welcome back from the break. I'm here with our friends Chris and Adi to continue our discussion of the third short story from Andrzej Sapkowski's Sword of Destiny, The Eternal Flame. When we left off, Geralt had arrived in Novigrad, where he and the bard Dandelion met an acquaintance, Dainty Biebervelt, who turned out to be not Dainty, but rather a Doppler named Dudu. After the Doppler escapes, Geralt, Dandelion, and the real Dainty Biebervelt hunt for the creature by piecing together the Doppler's bizarre purchases and trades. In Part 3, Dainty, Geralt, and Dandelion are informed by Vimy Vivaldi, a dwarven banker, of the events of the last 3 days. As it turns out, the Doppler's seemingly nonsensical purchases have all turned a profit for political or cultural reasons. The cochineal for a Kuhn Povis, imported mimosa bark as an alternative for Temerian oak bark, used for tanning hides, which is suffering an embargo, and so on. Dainty now has a staggering 21,969 crowns and 5 pennies in his account from Dudu's influence. Upon hearing that the other Dainty Biebervelt is in the market, the group go to confront him.
Yeah, how does a Doppler know everything? Like, he knows about the Kuhn Povis, how does he know that? He knows about the Druid embargo, how does he know that?
I think we don't know that he knows.
I think it's way too opportune.
I mean, it's very opportunistic, or at least it appears to be at first.
The thing I like is this entire chapter is just Geralt and Dainty being like told you're bad at your jobs.
A little bit.
Because Dainty's just like, what the hell's going on? He's made more money than I have like in like the year that I've been working.
That is also odd. If you copy someone exactly, presumably they would be at the same skill level.
That's my other question. As a Doppler, you adopt the mannerisms and the mentality of the other person, but do you still maintain the innate Dopplerness?
Both of these questions, for one, how does the Doppler know everything and why does he continue to be a merchant? I think all of these questions are things that we're going to get to in the fourth part.
I also like how Vivaldi tries to surmise everything and is making it seem like Dainty's thought process, well, technically Dudu's, but he thinks Dainty's thought process for how he like cornered the market so efficiently and so well is like this conniving and like oligarchical monopolistic way that Dainty's trying to like corner the market, but Dainty's just like, I gotta go.
So we're learning what's gone on the last few days as Geralt, Dandelion, and Dainty do. We get all this information from Vimy Vivaldi, who's been in contact with the fake Dainty, Dudu, the last 3 days. So Dudu had gone to Vimy Vivaldi a few times asking for loans and backed credit, etc., in order to purchase all this stuff. When the group comes in, there are all these little gnomes running around. Geralt, or the narrator, keeps calling them little somethings in hats, which comes across as really adorable when you actually read the book. But so all these little somethings are wandering around, just shouting out updates from the market. They keep giving information on the price of the mimosa bark. Then another one will run in and be like, but Dainty Biebervelt says to wait, and then he keeps running out. But obviously, the real Dainty Biebervelt is sitting in the room, but they're getting updates from this phantom Dainty Biebervelt that's apparently somewhere else. And apparently, Dudu has instructed these gnomes and Vimy Vivaldi to wait for 7-fold profit. And Dainty is just like, 6 1/6 is good enough. You've already turned over a 6-fold profit. And these little gnomes keep running in and being like, but Dainty says to wait. And then they run out.
Yeah, especially towards the end of it, Dainty initially is like saying things against what Dudu wants. And then towards the end, you see Dainty just be like, no, let's just keep going to where Dudu's target is.
So they're gnomes, they're halflings, they're dwarves.
Why is Dandelion freaked out by gnomes?
I don't think gnomes are as prominent in the Witcher world. I think there's only a few examples that we see of gnomes.
I think this is the only one as far as I can remember.
There's a gnome. There's Percival Schutenbach.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. So he's the only other gnome I can think of throughout the entire series. But this is our very first encounter with the gnome. And Geralt knows what they are. Dandelion doesn't.
What is Vimy Vivaldi?
Vimy Vivaldi is a dwarven banker. I don't really think they show up too much. Gnomes, at least, comparatively to dwarves. Dwarves, I would say, show up the most, and then halflings, and then gnomes. Both gnomes and dwarves are known for metalwork, swords, that sort of thing. One of the things that Vimy Vivaldi brings up as he's recounting the events from the last few days, he tells the group that the eternal fire, as it's known, is supposed to burn everywhere. Altars dedicated to that fire are going to be built everywhere, all over the city. A huge number of altars. Don't ask me for details, Dainty. I'm not very familiar with human superstitions, but I know that all the priests, and Chappelle also, are concerned about almost nothing else but those fires and that fire. Great preparations are being made. Taxes will be going up. That is certain. We get this nugget of information that doesn't seem terribly important, and that seems more to be a world-building piece of information as opposed to something that supports the plot. But that is something to remember, like this little bit about the Eternal Fire from Vimy Vivaldi. Because we also get a little bit of information from one of these gnomes, and the gnome runs in and says, Merchant Biebervalt instructs to buy more pots should they run out. Price no object, and then the little gnome runs out. We find out that Dudu, posing as Dainty, is in the Western Market. At the very end of the chapter, Vimy Vivaldi asks if the cod liver oil, the wax, those bowls, that twine, if it was a tactical gambit to distract everyone from the cochineal and the mimosa, which Dudu got a huge profit on.
The Doppler was buying random shit.
Yeah. No, it's like speculative commodity trading. This is where our economic degrees come in handy.
Thanks, economics. So there's a difference between value investors and speculative investors. And looks like what Dudu is doing is, speculative investors will buy cans of sardines. Cans of sardines have no use to them, obviously. They'll just buy it because the price will rise in the future.
What is funny to me is it is kind of similar to the hanza approach. The
price fixing?
Yeah, the historical hanza in Germany.
Okay.
Which I'm assuming Sapkowski is pretty familiar with, which their whole thing was buying goods that are otherwise completely useless, like cans of sardines, but they would buy all of it. They would have a monopoly on it, and they would just jack the price up.
Interesting.
So that seems similar to what Dudu is trying to do.
And we definitely get into the details of it much later, when he actually explains the reasons for why he's doing everything. They're interrupted at this point by another gnome who says that Sorrel reports that everything is ready and asks if he should start pouring. The real Dainty, our Dainty, says yes, at once. No one knows what's going on, and Dainty admits that he doesn't know what's going on, but the wheels of business must be oiled. And that's the end of part 3. In part 4, Dainty and Geralt give chase to the Doppler in a crowded Novigrad market. The Witcher corners Dudu in a stall, where he takes on Geralt's form, then Dandelion's. After a brief exchange, Geralt lets the Doppler go, but he's attacked by Vespula, Dandelion's angry lover. After Geralt captures the Doppler, he's caught up to by Dainty, Dandelion, and Chappelle, who's revealed to be a Doppler himself. Dudu is accepted as a distant cousin of the Biebervelt family as Dainty's factor in Novigrad. The group celebrates the Doppler's earnings, Geralt included, with a trip to the Passiflora on the Biebervelt tab.
It's a nice, wholesome, family-friendly ending.
Yeah.
Let's take a trip to the whorehouse.
I'll have a happy ending. Literally.
This part opens with Geralt kind of wandering the market, and he sees Vespula, arguing with some merchant, and then he just kind of hides and runs away before she can see him and recognize him. Eventually, though, they do get their eyes on Dudu as Dainty, and they start giving chase. There's an interesting line that says it was very clear why Dudu wasn't changing into anything else and staying as a halfling, because nobody could match the agility of a halfling other than another halfling, Dainty, or Witcher. So eventually, Geralt corners Dudu in this cold storage tent, and he's completely trapped. There's no way in or out of the tent other than straight through Geralt. So the Doppler and the Witcher start talking. The Doppler asks, "Why are you tormenting me?" Geralt says, "Telego, you're asking foolish questions. In order to come into possession of Biebervelt's horses and identity, you cut his head open and abandoned him in the wilds. You're still making use of his personality and ignoring the problems you're causing him. The devil only knows what else you're planning, but I shall confuse those plans in any event. I don't want to kill you or turn you over to the authorities, but you must leave the city. I'll see to it that you do." Dudu changes into Geralt briefly. Geralt is like, ew, is this what I look like? He's like, I'm hideous. Gross. And there's like a whole thing about that. But it's interesting because like when Geralt reaches for a sword, so does the Doppler. When Geralt swings a Melunet, so does the Doppler. The Doppler says, I am you. You will not gain an advantage over me. You cannot defeat me because I am you. And Geralt responds, you cannot have any idea what it means to be me, Mimic. And Dudu repeats, I am you. No, the Witcher countered, you are not. And do you know why? Because you're a poor little good-natured Doppler. A Doppler who, after all, could have killed Biebervelt and buried his body in the undergrowth, by doing so gaining total safety and utter certainty that he would not be unmasked ever by anybody, including the halfling spouse, the famous Gardenia Biebervelt. But you didn't kill him, Teleco, because you didn't have the courage, because you're a poor little good-natured Doppler whose close friends call him Dudu, and whoever you might change into, you'll always be the same. You only know how to copy what is good in us because you don't understand the bad in us. That's what you are, Doppler.
Pui pui.
That's actually a very, like, positive thing to say, you know? It makes the Doppler seem like such a gentle character, and you're kind of just like, why don't they just take over?
He just doesn't have the gumption to kill.
I mean, Geralt had said earlier in the chapter, because the group had questions for Geralt about, isn't it an aggressor? And Geralt says, well, it mostly uses the shape-shifting for defense rather than aggression. And then Dainty is obviously upset by it, and he's like, no, well, he hit me in the head. He's definitely aggressive.
It's also funny how Dudu's like this character whose literal skill is to assimilate, and they're the ones of all the characters having the most trouble assimilating.
There's this very long monologue. After turning into Geralt, the Doppler Dudu eventually turns into Dandelion instead and confronts the Witcher. He says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Witcher. I'll go on my way, squeeze my way into the crowd, and change quietly into any old body, even a beggar, because I prefer being a beggar in Novigrad to being a Doppler in the wilds. Novigrad owes me something, Geralt. The building of a city here tainted a land that we could have lived in our natural form. We have been exterminated, hunted down like rabid dogs. I'm one of the few to survive. I want to survive, and I will survive. Long ago, when wolves pursued me in the winter, I turned into a wolf and ran with the pack for several weeks, and survived. Now I'll do that again, because I don't want to roam about through wildernesses and be forced to winter beneath fallen trees. I don't want to be forever hungry. I don't want to serve as target practice all the time. Here in Novigrad, it's warm, there's grub. I can make money, and very seldom do people shoot arrows at each other. Novigrad is a pack of wolves. I'll join that pack and survive, understand? You gave dwarves, halflings, gnomes, and even elves the modest possibility of assimilation. Why should I be any worse off? Why am I denied that right? What do I have to do to be able to live in the city? Turn into a she-elf with doe eyes, silky hair, and long legs? Well, in what way is a she-elf better than me? Only that at the sight of the she-elf you pick up speed, and at the sight of me you want to puke? You know where you can stuff an argument like that. I'll survive anyway. I know how to. As a wolf I ran, I howled, and I fought with others over a she-wolf. As a resident of Novigrad, I'll trade, weave wicker baskets, beg, or steal. As one of you, I'll do what one of you usually does. Who knows, perhaps I'll even take a wife. And then Dudu talks back at Geralt, saying, like, you're not going to try to stop me. Because I, Geralt, knew your thoughts for a moment, including the ones you don't want to admit to, the ones you even hide from yourself. Because to stop me, you'd have to kill me. And the thought of killing me in cold blood fills you with disgust, doesn't it? It's a very loaded monologue from Dudu.
I like when he's like, I might even take a wife. First off, that's insinuating that Dopplers have genders. Secondly, what would you do if you married someone? 20 years of perfect marriage, 3 kids, come home, and there's just mud mixed with flour in your bed.
Honey, you may want to sit down for this. I got something to tell you.
But it is a very deep moment where you kind of see like the level of insight, the emotion that's carried with Dudu. So he obviously hits Geralt at this particular point, which is like, you're part of a group that is ostracized. Why can't I try to live and survive the way that you do? The message is not lost on Geralt, obviously, because he lets him go. And then it turns to, the comical Three Stooges scene.
Dudu leaves the tent as Dandelion, and he starts singing, he starts, winking at girls, and he's very Dandelion as he's walking out, and Geralt follows him very slowly. Vespula comes out of nowhere and attacks the Doppler with a very large frying pan. The hit makes Dudu kind of fall apart, and Geralt sees this and wraps him up in a rug very quickly and then just, holds him.
I don't know what the hell she's been doing this entire time. Decides to show up and is like, I still got things to throw at you. And I can't imagine what Dudu's thinking.
Bashed in the skull by, the pot or whatever it is.
Which is a very comical turnaround. Like, this deep emotional scene. And this woman just comes and bashes him in the head with a pen.
We just want to assimilate. Dude just turns around. He's walking away. Here I go again. Plays by Whitesnake. The credits are starting to roll. And he just gets smacked in the head by this frying pan.
I mean, the whole thing is like incredibly, incredibly comical, which I think, as we said, every time we see Dandelion, it's definitely an indicator that it's going to be a fun scene full of hijinks and all sorts of chaos.
I also have to give credit to Sapkowski for, I forget what the term for the literary tool is, but when you introduce something in the very beginning of a story and then reintroduce it towards the end when you've already forgotten about it and don't think it could have any role in the plot anymore, and here it ends up having a role in the plot. Because this whole situation allows us to move forward to the second half.
Anton Chekhov.
It's like the thing about the loaded gun, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yes. Chekhov's loaded gun.
Chekhov's gun.
So Vespula is totally the gun in this case. Like, we see her loaded in the beginning, and then she completely goes off by the end. As Geralt is, like, either sitting on top of or holding this kind of wrapped up Doppler, Dainty and the real Dandelion show up, which, upon seeing a second Dandelion, Vespula runs off. A crowd begins to form. Once Chappelle arrives, the entire crowd disperses. The Witcher is very protective of this blanket, which is currently wrapped around the Doppler. And Chappelle comes very close to Geralt and then starts talking to Dudu as Dudu. So Chappelle leans over and tells, Dudu, turn into Bieberwald, now. And everyone is sufficiently confused.
Well, that's where it all comes together.
Yes, this is 100% where it all comes together. Not only with the character development and the plot, but also with all of the trading. We learn a lot more about Dudu's actions and the purpose for them. Chappelle asks Dainty, after Dudu has transformed into him, "Who do you think that is, Dainty? Very similar to you, don't you think?" The halfling looks at Chappelle and says, "He's my cousin, a close relative, Dudu Bieberwelt of Knotgrass Meadow, an astute businessman. I've decided to appoint him my factor in Novigrad. What do you say to that, cousin?" And then Dudu accepts his position as the newest Bieberwelt. Geralt asks, "Has your dream about life in the city come true? What do you see in this Dudu and you, Chappelle?" And Chappelle mutters back, "Had you lived in the moors and eaten roots, got soaked and frozen, you'd know. We also deserve something from life, Geralt. We aren't inferior to you." And Geralt asks what happened to the real Chappelle. And this fake Chappelle, who we now know as a Doppler, says, "Popped his cogs 2 months ago. Apoplexy. May the earth lie lightly on him, and may the eternal fire light his way. I happened to be in the vicinity. No one noticed." "Geralt, you aren't going to." And then Geralt says, "Notice what?" He also asks, "Is there more of you?" The fake Chappelle asks, "Is it important?" And Geralt says, "No, it isn't." I think just circle back around to the question that you guys had earlier. We really don't know how prominent they are in society because their nature is that they blend in so well.
Well, yeah, Chappelle comes in. Nobody had any idea. They did foreshadow it. Dainty was saying, I don't understand how he's still alive. I know he's had heart problems. And then, now we find out, apparently he did have heart problems. Kind of worked in Chappelle 2.0's version in his favor.
I mean, there's a brief part in part 3 where Vimy Vivaldi, after finding out that Chappelle is kind of on to Dainty, says that, there's something oddly virtuous about Chappelle after his last bout of whatever. Dainty can't believe it. He's just Psh, Chappelle, righteous. He was there's no way. And then as it turns out, it was actually a Doppler. But I think we can assume, based on what we know about Dopplers and on Dudu's transformation into Dainty, and also Chappelle 2.0 saying, when he talks about the real Chappelle, he's "Oh, may the earth lie lightly on him and may the eternal fire light his way." There's probably still a little bit of the real Chappelle's personality in there, despite it being a Doppler. So little impulses and intuitions and instincts that we had previously talked about are probably still there, despite the real Chappelle being dead.
I want to know what the situation was that the Chappelle 1.0 was just by himself, has his heart attack, and there's, conveniently this pile of mud mixed with flour just next by being well, this is an opportunity.
It's a 1 in a million shot. That's like winning the lottery.
But actually, it is. Also, it's interesting that they have a community or a sense of community. How many Dopplers are there helping each other out?
There is a recurring theme in The Witcher where humans actually ultimately get their way. Even if they're fighting really hardcore monsters, eventually they just do find a way and they kill everything.
I think it's the same sort of like colonization that we see not only in our own worlds, but in the Witcher world as well. This kind of full frontal attack on everything and anything that we can take. You know, it's everything from taking land from monsters and creatures to taking land from elves and dwarves. Dudu does say in his monologue to Geralt in this part, we could have lived here. Like, the city has now tainted a land that we could have lived on in our natural form.
Fair point.
So the very last thing that we get in this part is learning why Dudu was doing what he was doing. So we find out that all the raw materials that Dudu had sourced cost 45 crowns. He eventually sold whatever he'd made for 4 crowns apiece, which took in 2,400 crowns. So as it turns out, the cod liver oil, wax, and oil, dyed with a little cochineal, need only be poured into earthenware bowls with a piece of string dipped into it. The string, when lit, gives a beautiful red flame, which burns for a long time and doesn't smell. The eternal fire. The priests needed vigil lights for the altars of the eternal fire. Now they don't need them. All this disparate, nonsensical junk that he seemed to buy was really to manufacture something new and something that was needed and non-taxable. It was a very clever ploy on Dudu's part.
So all this like coup in Povis, all that stuff is just like, it just so happened to be that was going on at the same time?
That would be my guess. My guess is that the selling of the extra cochineal that he had to Povis was more of an opportunistic move. It seems like that he bought the cochineal in order to make those vigil lights, and then it just so happened that the coup in Povis happened. He already had the wares in the stores, so he was able to ship it off and make a profit. At least I would make the assumption that he didn't know about the coup. It just so happened that he already had it.
If your theory is true, then Dudu had no intention of making money. He just wanted to buy the materials and then use that. But the opportunity arose where he could make money. And then at the end of the story, the additional opportunity arises where he can assimilate successfully by taking on the position as Dainty's cousin.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm also not sold on if that was his initial intention.
To make this stuff for the Eternal Fire?
Yeah, because he said that it made it tax exempt, but that it is a side effect of him selling the goods in the way that he did.
Yeah, because he eventually made those candles. And because the candles were done in the service of religion, he didn't have to pay a tax on candles.
Right, but he sold the cochineal for the uniforms.
So that would be taxed.
Wait, yeah, because that's why he has to pay tax in the first place, is because the cochineal made a bunch of money, and that's why what's-his-name came after him for the tax money. So the cochineal he could not have known was going purely to the candles.
We need to do some forensic accounting. We need to crack open his accounting books. Hey, I went to accounting camp when I was 16. I'll do it.
That sounds like the most boring kind of camp.
You would be not incorrect. But what was his original motive? It was just to make a ton of money? What, just like live in Novigrad?
I would assume that because he had assaulted Dainty in the woods, he must have already been there for God knows how long. But he might have just been in the woods in his Doppler form, and Dainty might have just been a very easy way to get to Novigrad as some sort of, acceptable being. So now that we've wrapped up all the plot points for this chapter, The Eternal Flame, did you guys have any additional thoughts on it?
It's like a really fun story. Again, it's interesting to see some of these characters come up again in Witcher 3.
I really enjoyed the overall message of the story. I thought it was pretty significant and substantial. Sort of this, minority character that's trying to just live and survive and assimilate. I really enjoy uses of Chekhov's gun and the ability to sort of make a plot come around. So all the characters involved, they eventually come and finish off the story in a nice, happy, overall positive way, which is not too common in a lot of the Witcher stories.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a nice break from Geralt having to just like murder incessantly.
Yeah.
Because not like a super serious story. It's like way chiller.
Yeah, I don't think he murders anyone in this whole story.
Yeah. I don't think a single person dies. Does anybody die? Well, besides Chappelle, but I think Chappelle probably died before the start of the story.
And no one dies.
It's like 3 days without accidents on the job.
Yeah.
We'll reset the clock after this story. I mean, I think one of the greatest things about this story is, as you said, like the characters, the way that they're used, and the humor. It does a really nice job of exemplifying the kind of humor that you can find in Sapkowski's work and in this saga. It's very fun. It's very self-referential and a little bit meta at times. It doesn't take itself too seriously, which I think is really nice for high fantasy. It makes the whole thing very enjoyable and very palatable. It's one of the things that I admire most about Sapkowski's work really is the dialogue. And a lot of that is done so well here with all the characters' unique and distinct voices. And then I think the last thing that we see here, which we've already talked about, and that isn't a new idea, is how non-humans aren't allowed to assimilate into human society. So this is something that we've already explored in things like The Edge of the World, as well as a few other different short stories, and as we'll see in the saga. But this idea of assimilation and the relationships between humans and non-humans continually comes up throughout the story.
Yeah, it's, I think, a main like theme of his whole corpus.
Yes.
It does feel like a nice break from the main story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is a fun little break.
So did you guys have anything else that you wanted to add?
Go watch the Polish show.
Yes, we've heard a little bit about the Polish adaptation from our friends Cyprian, as well as Anita and Carolina from Witcher Kitchen, and now Adi.
Just have fun. If you don't like it, just pretend it never happened.
So that is it for our show today. Chris, Adi, thanks for joining us for this episode, and thank you to our Hanza for listening. Is there anything that our community can help you with, or anything that you'd like to share with them?
It's funny that you mentioned up the whole Chappelle profits tax. I'm a PhD student. One of the things that I study is comparative tax systems, and it's really interesting to dive into like medieval taxes and like really old school taxes, which I know to most people would sound super dry and boring, but it was really fascinating the way that they had, even as far as back as the 13th century, for example, they had direct taxes. So they tried their best to say, oh, if you're a rich person, you should pay more taxes. If you're poor, you should pay fewer taxes. And they tried to like actually account for all those kinds of things with various degrees of success and failure.
And I think we're still working on it, aren't we?
Oh, yeah. It's amazing what a huge, gargantuan, nightmarish Byzantine structure of taxation, or like the U.S. tax code, for example, that we had.
And Chris, is there anything that you wanted to share?
Don't forget, everyone, tax season is coming. Make sure you file for extensions early.
Don't let what happened to Dainty happen to you.
That's the moral of the story. Be on top of your taxes, y'all.
or tax exempted.
Get a good lawyer. Just get a good lawyer.
No, get a good accountant.
Why not both? Porque
no los dos.
No los dos. Struggle bus, Spanish. Next episode, we're heading over to Germany with our friend Louisa to explore themes of love, loss, poetry, and the sea in the short story A Little Sacrifice.
And that's it. That's a wrap, guys.
Bye. Thanks for joining us at the Breakfast Table. For show notes, transcripts of each episode, and a complete list of our social platforms and listening services, head over to breakfastandbeauclair.com. Breakfast and Beauclair is created by Alyssa from GoodMorhen. It's hosted by Alyssa with the Tidings from Toussaint news segment by Larson Witcherflix. The show is edited by Alyssa with the Breakfast and Beauclair theme by Mojo Filter Media and Tidings from Toussaint theme by Bettina Campomanes. Breakfast and Beauclair is produced by Alyssa in New York City with Louise of Covier, the owner of the Charlish Porpoise, Cool Guy Henry Eric Sagadling, Katie, the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob Mahaka Melder Joe, Julie, Sylvia Skelgo, Wolpe, Brandon Jefferson, Eva of Gallit, and Eric the Bear of Beauclair. Special thanks to Chris and Audie for joining us for this episode, and our international Hanza for their support.